Okay, so we are picking up in Genesis 49. Hopefully we're finishing Genesis today. We started in September. We stuck Job in the middle of it, but finishing, this will be 2 books finished. So we are starting in verse 1. And Lois, I'm going to have you start with verse 1. Or, yeah,
Just one?
just 1.
And Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourself together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days.
Okay, so Jacob is going to give a blessing to each son. Some of them don't seem very much like a blessing. But this chapter is written in the style of a poem. And there are if you could read Hebrew, you would see lots and lots of word plays. And there's a lot of ambiguity. So some of it's kind of fuzzy. Some of it, they would have said, well, what does that mean? And we can see how some of it came to pass. But some of it is still future. Okay, verse 2.
Assemble and listen, O sons of Jacob, listen to Israel your father.
So this is Jacob's last significant act. And he's the heir to Abraham and Isaac, and this is going to end the age of the patriarchs. And again, he's going to prophesy a blessing on each son. And they're not necessarily blessings in the way we think of blessings, but they are prophecies about what God is going to do with each of these tribes in the future. So, Jewish traditions, as fun as anything else, they tell us that Jacob was going to tell them the secrets of the ages. But at the moment, the glory of God came, and he forgot what the secrets were. We don't see anything that he knew the secrets of the ages and the secrets of the end time. But this is the first conscious prophecy spoken by a man in the Bible. Any other prophecy we've seen, it was something announced by God. And then other veiled prophecies. But this is the first conscious prophecy. So we're going to go tribe by tribe. Verses 3 and 4.
Reuben, you are my firstborn, my strength, and the first fruits of my virility, excelling in prominence, excelling in power. Turbulent as water you will not excel, because you got into your father's bed and you defiled it. He got into my bed.
So normally the firstborn inherits the property. He inherits the leadership of the family and the spiritual leadership, but he messed up majorly. He had slept with one of his dad's concubines, the mother of Dan and Naphtali. Big no-no. So he got those inheritance rights taken away from him. Verse 3 shows the potential that Reuben had. Verse 4 shows what he did with it. He had committed sin, and it had its consequences to it. Verse 4, when it talks about unstable, yours may say uncontrolled, or insolvent, or went astray, or uncontrollable. It was meant to be an arrogant term. It's termed as boiling water spilling over a container. It's a total rejection of society's norms. And it's putting your own desires against what you should normally do. So when he talks about water, what happens when you try to lean on water?
Get wet.
Yeah, he's saying, Reuben, I can lean on you like I can lean on water. I can't lean on you. So because of this instability, the birthright instead of being in one person, it's being split up. Different sons will have different parts of the birthright. So the tribe of Reuben is never ever going to be an important tribe. No prophet, no judge, no king ever comes from the tribe of Reuben. Reuben's an example of how the first can be last. Now we get two brothers at once, verses 5 through 7.
Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel.
Okay, Simeon and Levi, second and third born sons, they get an identical blessing because they had the identical sin. They are the two that went and destroyed the town of Shechem and killed all the men in retaliation for the rape of their sister Dinah. So they lost the chances at inheritance. And even though Jacob didn't really do anything at the time, except maybe like a self-centered complaint, he remembers the sin. Again, sin, there's consequences to sin. Even when they're forgiven, there's consequences. So the basis of their problem was anger. Their anger was sin because it was rooted in self-will. Sometimes anger is a righteous anger, but their anger wasn't. So I have a funny story about a minor league manager who had an anger problem. In 2007, the minor league manager of the Mississippi Braves threw a major meltdown tantrum. And he made the national spotlight, if only for a moment, his 15 minutes of fame. He was losing against the Chattanooga Lookouts, and he was furious about a call from the umpire, home plate. So he charged out of the dugout, stood nose to nose with the umpire, and began screaming. He then framed his face and shook his hands, screaming the whole time. Then he stormed a home plate. He knelt on one knee, covered the plate with dirt, drew a new plate that was about 3 feet wide. Then after going and yelling at the third base umpire, he stole third base. Literally picked it up, pulled it out of the ground. Then he walked over to second base and he hurled the plate out into out of the infield. But that's not what got people talking. Next, he dropped on the ground, crawled to the pitcher's mound, took the pitcher's rosin bag, and pulled out an imaginary pin, and he lobbed it like it was a grenade at the home plate umpire. Then he headed for the outfield. On the way, he uprooted second base and picked up third base and walked out of the field. He blew a kiss to the crowd. They were all cheering. Earned him a lot of recognition and 3-game suspension.
Just 3? Just 3?
Yeah.
I was expecting more.
Some people just really enjoyed it and thought it was great. Others thought, what a horrible example he was. That's an example of anger out of control. And we knew Simeon and Levi had that kind of anger too. Ephesians 4:26 says, "Be angry and do not sin." So, again, there are times to be angry with a godly anger. But the Bible also says, "Let all bitterness, wrath, anger be put away from you." So, there's a prophecy about dividing and scattering. That turned out to be a curse for Simeon. They ended up being the smallest tribe numerically. When they leave Egypt in 400 years, they're the third largest tribe, but they're going to lose 63% of their tribe along the way and become the smallest tribe. They don't get their own land in Canaan because they're so small. They get a little piece of the land that belongs to Judah. Now it ends up being a blessing for Levi because later Levi is going to do the right thing during the incident with the golden calf. So they're going to get rewarded and they're going to become the priests. And because of this, they don't own one area of land. They're going to be spread across the country so they can be priests, and they'll own little bits of land all over the place. So that's how that prophecy played out. Okay, now the biggest set of prophecy for Judah, verses 8 through 12.
Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the necks of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is a young lion, my son. You return from the kill. He crouches, he lies down like a lion and like a lioness. Who wants to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the peoples belongs to him. He ties his donkey to a vine, and the colt of his donkey to the choice vine. He washes his clothes in wine, and his robes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, and his teeth are whiter than milk.
Okay, so Judah wasn't innocent. He didn't take care of his daughter-in-law Tamar when he should have, and he had sex with her when she disguised herself as a prostitute. But he redeems himself later when he offers himself as a sacrifice for Benjamin back in chapter 44. Overall, this blessing is an example of God's mercy and his grace. A lot of this is pointing to his greatest descendant, Jesus Christ, who's king forever. Lots of references to Judah having a ruling leadership role among his brothers. He's the one that inherited the firstborn's inheritance. What it meant is eventually leaders of Israel are going to come from his tribe. David, Solomon, the ultimate leader, Jesus. Verse 9, it talks about Jesus, or it talks about the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Revelation 5:5 refers to Jesus as the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Verse 10, it could say, the last part of the verse says, mine says until tribute comes to him. It could say until Shiloh comes. That prophecy is going to take about 640 years to come with the reign of David. That's the first of Judah's dynasty of kings. Ultimately, 1600 years later, it'll be fulfilled again with Jesus. Jesus is sometimes referred to as Shiloh, which means he whose right it is, or to whom it belongs. And anytime you see the word Shiloh, it's understood to be talking about the Messiah. For the time period between David and the Herods, there was a prince of Judah over Israel in some way or form, including Daniel was from Judah. Even though they had foreign masters, they still had some right to self-rule until about 7 AD. At that time, the Herods and the Romans took away their rights, especially their right to capital punishment. They weren't allowed to punish criminals with death. They had to go through the Herods and the Romans, and we see that with Jesus. And when that happened, the rabbis considered this a disaster because they felt the scepter had fallen from Judah, that Judah was no longer in charge, and they didn't see a Messiah. It said that the rabbis would walk the streets of Jerusalem, saying, Woe unto us, for the scepter has been taken away from Judah, and Shiloh has not come. But we know differently. Shiloh is walking the earth. He's probably about 12 years old at that point. Now, when it talks about the foal and the vine, what do you think happens when you tie a donkey to a grapevine with grapes? They're gonna eat the grapes. It's kind of dumb to tie a donkey to a grapevine. You would tie a donkey to a post or something. So what it's talking about is if you tied a donkey to a grapevine, means you got plenty of grapes. You're not worried about them being eaten. It means there will be an abundance. Judah's land was going to be a wine growing country. And that does happen. Okay, let's go on to Zebulun, verse 13. And Betty, that would be you.
Okay. Zebulun will dwell, how far? Just that one verse? Okay. Zebulun will dwell at the seashore, and he shall be a haven for ships, and his flank shall be toward Sidon.
Okay, so up till now we've been in birth order. Now we're not going in birth order, we're going in mother order. Zebulun was also a son of Leah. Zebulun, the tribe of Zebulun, was known for its faithfulness to David. They supplied a lot of soldiers to David, more than any other tribe. So they settled in the land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Sea of Galilee. So when it talks about he shall become a haven for ships, both borders. You know, fishing ships on one side and trade ships on the other. And because of that, trade's going to be important to the tribe of Zebulun. And again, Jacob is saying this stuff more than 400 years before any of this is going to happen. Verse 14 and 15 for Issachar.
Issachar is a strong donkey, crouching between the sheepfolds. He saw that a resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. So he bowed his shoulders to bear and became a servant at forced labor.
So they become the fourth largest tribe. And because they were so big, they were often targets of armies around them, and who often made them slaves. Now there's two different interpretations I found about this prophecy. One says Issachar is strong, and the other one says they're lazy. But the main aim seems to be that they found a good resting place and a land that's pleasant. Okay, verses 16 and 17.
Okay. Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a snake by the road, a viper beside the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider falls backwards.
You can picture that, like from a western or something, huh? With a snake biting at the heel of a horseman. The tribe of Dan did judge. They supplied one of the most prominent judges, Samson. He came from the tribe of Dan. But it was a troublesome tribe. You can picture just how powerful a little snake can be against a horse. And the snake that Jacob probably has in mind is probably, there's a poisonous yellow snake that would hide in crevices and burrows, and it would strike out at people and animals. Yeah. So the tribe of Dan would be small but powerful. Some people think viper by the path, or serpent, by the way, whatever way yours says, refers to the idea that the Antichrist will come from the tribe of Dan. Dan introduces idolatry into Israel in Judges 18. Jeroboam sets up one of his golden calves in Dan in 1 Kings 12. And later Dan, the land of Dan, becomes the center of idol worship. So not good things for Dan. In the listing of the 144,000 in Revelation 7, the tribe of Dan is completely left out. But in Ezekiel 48, they're listed in what's called the millennial roll call. So not completely wiped out, but they're not in a good place. Now here's a strange verse. Verse 18, in the middle of all this.
I wait for your salvation, Lord.
Okay, right in the middle of all these prophecies. The word for salvation is Yeshua. At this point in the prophecy, when Jacob is near death, he called out for God's salvation with Yeshua. English translation, Jesus. He's already calling for Jesus. Okay, back to prophecies. Verse 19.
Raiders shall raid Gad, but he shall raid at their heels.
Okay, this is one of those examples in Hebrew that is a really big play on words using the same letters as throughout. One translation in English kind of tries to get that idea. It says, a group of guards will gather to get Gad's goods. And now in Hebrew, that's the kind of writing they did. So it was very poetic. And Gad later, they're gonna supply the best troops for David. Not the most, because we've already seen the tribe that supplied the most, but they're gonna provide the best trained. During the time of Jeremiah and other times, foreign armies came against Gad. Yet in the end, they're going to be victorious. Verse 20.
Asher's food shall be rich, and he shall yield royal delicacies.
Okay, so apparently the land that was occupied by Asher, really good land, great crops, so great that they supplied the food for Solomon's table out of their land. Verse 21, Naphtali is a doe let loose that bears beautiful fawns. Naphtali was in the area of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus did most of his ministry and teaching. So much of Jesus's teaching was in the area, so it was fitting to say it bears beautiful fawns or uses beautiful words. Now here's a longer one, verses 22 through 26.
Joseph is a fruitful bow, even a fruitful bow by the well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have solely grieved him and shot at him and hated him. But his bow abode in strength, and his arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From hence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, even by God of the Father, who shall help thee, by the Almighty, who shall bless thee with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lieth under, blessings of beast and of the womb. The blessings of thy father have prevailed above the blessings of thy progenitors unto the uttermost bound of everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him that was separate from his brethren.
Okay, even though Joseph was hated, he was still fruitful. It's because God's hands were on him for a purpose. We see God's hands in these verses a lot, and they give him strength even when Joseph didn't know it. And Joseph, he has two tribes that come out of him, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they are among the biggest. They are extremely blessed. In these verses, we get 5 titles for Jesus. The mighty God, for God. The mighty God of Jacob, the shepherd, the stone of Israel, the God of your father, the Almighty. It shows that Jacob really understood who God was. Verse 26, when it talks about being set apart from his brothers, it comes from the root word Nazarite. We're going to learn a lot more about Nazarites as we go through, but it's a Nazarite vow was a special vow men took that involved some really specific rules. Some famous Nazarites, Samson and John the Baptist. So we're going to learn a lot more about the Nazarite vow. Okay, verse 27.
Benjamin is a ravenous wolf, in the morning devouring the prey, and at evening dividing the spoil.
Okay, tribe of Benjamin had a reputation for being a fierce tribe. We get Ehud. He's one of my favorite warriors because he was left-handed. Saul and Paul all came from Benjamin. If you read Judges 19 and 20, you will especially see the cruelty of the tribe of Benjamin. All from that poor little young kid. Okay, verse 28.
These are the tribes of Israel, 12 in all, and this is what their father said to them. He blessed them, and he blessed each one with a suitable blessing.
The blessings are over. This is the first time that we hear the term 12 tribes. The tribes are going to be very important to the Jews. They would keep track of which tribe they're from for centuries and centuries. I researched to see if Jews still know what tribe they come from. And some claim to know what tribe they come from, but interestingly, the only ones that claim to know what tribe they come from claim they come from Judah or Levi. No one ever claims to be from any other tribe. But the experts say no one knows what tribe they were from. It's just, they just don't have it in them. But at the time of Jesus, everybody knows what tribe they're from. It was that important to them. And some of the things mentioned with these tribes may seem a little cloudy, but they are still waiting for a future fulfillment. So each son and tribe had their own calling and destiny. The most remarkable thing is that each tribe is going to survive and grow. None of the tribes are going to die out over the centuries. They may get small, but they're going to still be there. Verses 29 through 32.
Through 32, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Then he commanded them, I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. The cave is in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. This is the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite as a burial site. Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there, and I buried Leah there. The field and the cave in it were purchased from the Hittites.
Okay, first time we hear about Rebekah and Leah being buried. You notice which wife is not buried there? Rachel. You would think if he buried anyone specifically, it would be Rachel, but circumstances didn't allow it. So he's going to leave instructions on his burial. He knows Egypt is not his home. He doesn't want to be buried there. He's the son of a promise, the heir of God's covenant with Abraham and Isaac. And he asked to be buried in the land. He asked to be buried in the same place that his ancestors are buried. Egypt is full of magnificent tombs. And because of the respect Jacob had because of Joseph, he probably could have been buried like a king. But he wants to be buried in a cave in Canaan. That's the land of promise. And that's where he wants to stay. Verse 33. Betty?
I'm just not seeing it.
It's there.
It's a little one stuck in there.
Oh, when Jacob finished charging his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathed his last, and was gathered to his people.
Okay, drew his feet into the bed. There were a couple different explanations. Like if he had been sitting up this whole time, it just means he lay down. Or if he'd been laying down, that he went into a fetal position. No one had like a positive thing of what exactly that means. But he dies, and this is the absolute end of the patriarchs. But God's work isn't done. It's going to carry on through his descendants. Last chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 3.
Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days.
40 days for embalming. But that's what it was. Now, Hebrews didn't normally embalm people. They buried people within a day because they didn't embalm. But Joseph wants his father to be embalmed because they're not going to bury him within a day. They're going to take him back to Israel. You don't want to carry an embalmed body through the desert, or an embalmed body through the desert. So he gets embalmed. So it's got to be a dramatic scene when Joseph falls on him and cries. So Joseph is so respected in the land that the whole land mourns for his father 70 days. Now, if a pharaoh died, you mourned 72 days. So Jacob is mourned just short of what a royal person would be buried with. That's a great honor. So it's a good thing they embalmed him. They're mourning him 70 days before they do anything. A little over 2 months. Verses 4 through 6.
And when the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household, "If I have found favor with you, please tell Pharaoh that my father made me take an oath, saying, I am about to die, and thus bury me there in the tomb that I made for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, then I will return." So Pharaoh said, "Go and bury your father in keeping with your oath."
So Joseph doesn't go directly to Pharaoh. He sends a message. Doesn't say specifically why, but it could be because he's observing Hebrew mourning customs. So the custom is don't shave, don't cut your hair, basically go wild. So it's been 2 months since he shaved, and he's probably wearing sackcloth. So they probably had a rule against people showing up to Pharaoh not looking their best. So he probably did not. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation. But he explains the promise he made to his father, and Pharaoh says, "Keep your promise." And Joseph says, "I'll return." Now, 400 years later, when the Jews went to go temporarily into the desert to worship God, that Pharaoh's going to say, no, you're not coming back. Whole different thing. Okay, now verse 7 through 11.
Do you want me to? Okay. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Ada,
Sounds good.
which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented
Mm-hmm.
there with a very great and grievous lamentation, and he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning of the threshing floor of Ada, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan.
So not only does Pharaoh say, yeah, go, he sends a ton of people along. He sends, here's a list of everybody that goes: Joseph, the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, the elders of the land of Egypt, the household of Joseph, Joseph's brothers, Jacob's household, a military escort. It wasn't a small group that went off on this trip. And they left their herds and their kids, so yes, they have to come back. We don't know why, but they kind of take a strange route to get there. They don't go the straight route. They travel northeast and enter Canaan from the east, from the other side of the Jordan. This route is similar to what the Israelites will take when they come 400 years later. But why they went that way, don't know. And when they stop, they start some ritual mourning. This is not the burial site. So they're going to do ritual mourning. And you can imagine the attention that gets from the Canaanites when you bring a big group of people like that into their land. They're going, oh, this guy must have been really important. And he was. Okay, verses 12 through 14.
Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field of Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephraim the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father.
So they leave. Everybody else in Jacob's family are the only ones that go to the actual burial site. Jacob's sons, everyone but Joseph and Benjamin, had disappointed their dad so much in his life. They want to make sure they honor him in death. So the cave that they bury him in, we saw it back in Genesis 23:9. It's where Abraham bought a cave to bury Sarah in. It's the only piece of land ever owned by Abraham, only piece of land owned by Isaac and Jacob. Sarah, Abraham, Isaac, Rebecca, and Leah are all buried there. So they're all reunited in their bodies. The only difference is that Jacob is mummified. So that would be interesting to find that cave, because the Egyptians were good at embalming. You'd have a bunch of bones and a mummy. Okay, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." How long had it been?
17 years since
17?
the family had been reunited.
17 years. They thought Joseph was just faking it because Dad was alive. They thought now that Dad's gone, well, now he's going to get his revenge. When it says that Joseph will hate us, it's the same hate word used about Esau and his feelings toward Jacob. So they thought he really hated them. He'd taken care of them for 17 years. Sometimes we can be like the brothers. You know, God forgives us completely, yet we still think he holds something against us. We still think we got to do something. They finally admit that they had done evil against Joseph. But what they're worried about now is justice. They feared righteous retribution. And Joseph certainly had the power to do it. So they're shaking in their boots. Verses 16 through 18.
And they sent a messenger unto Joseph, saying, The father did command before he died, saying, So shall ye say unto Joseph, Forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sins, for they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke unto him. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, Behold, we be thy servants.
Notice they're so afraid they don't even go face to face. They send a messenger. Now, do you think Jacob ever told them what they say everyone, all the commentaries pretty much agree that they probably made it up. They didn't feel they had the right to ask for mercy, but if it came from Dad, it'd be okay. So they're still the brothers. Why do you think Joseph wept?
Joseph wept all the time.
Yeah, he was.
I started like circling all the times that I mentioned Joseph wept, and I was like, oh my gosh, he was so emotional. Which he went through a lot, so
Yeah.
it makes sense. But yeah, he was not afraid to show his emotions at all.
No, he wasn't. And again, when it says they wept, it's not little crocodile tears. It's like loud weeping. So why this time?
He probably felt hurt a little bit because he thought he already had to leave that issue already, and it gets brought back up again. He just, it's like reopening that wound a little bit. Like he felt hurt.
I think that's a good answer. No one has.
But all
It
he
doesn't
has
say.
done for him already.
He's still lying.
Yeah, true, yeah. Haven't you learned your lesson yet? Now the brothers show up to Joseph and they fall on their knees and they humble themselves and plead for mercy.
Like father, like sons.
Mm-hmm. Verse 19 through 21.
But Joseph said to them, Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them.
Okay, verse 20. That's one of those verses, one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. You notice Joseph doesn't excuse what they did. He doesn't romanticize it. He doesn't say, oh, that's okay, brothers. You didn't mean it. No, they meant it. You knew that. But he sees Romans 8:28. God works all things together for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Joseph knows it's God's position to judge, not his. Not his job to bring retribution. If the Lord chooses to punish them, it won't be through Joseph. From a human perspective, if we were Joseph, how many of us would have just wiped our brothers out? But he, or punished them some way, threw them in prison, did something. He had the right to do that, the human right, but that's not what God wanted. This is such an important truth for us, that no matter what evil men bring, God can use it for us. He can use it for good. Our lives aren't in the hands of men, but they're in the hands of God. He can overrule anything. So Joseph saw the immediate good in everything that had happened. He saw a lot of lives were saved, including his family. But there's a long-term good. The Hebrews were taken out of Canaan. If they had stayed in Canaan, they would have been intermarried with all the Canaanites. Idolatry would have been brought to the family. God needed them to be a separate nation, and that was accomplished. Even though he knew his brothers meant evil, he reciprocates with love. And he reassures them he's going to keep taking care of their families. What a strong man he is. Because, yeah, he's probably really hurt. And he's still showing God's love through all this. Okay, verses 22 through 24.
Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation. The sons of Manasseh's son, Machir, were recognized by Joseph. Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land, to the land he swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay, 50 years later. This is 50 years. He's blessed to see Ephraim's children to the third generation, meaning his great-grandchildren. Joseph was the human most responsible for bringing his family to Egypt. But he knew that God's covenant means they wouldn't live there forever. They were going to go back to Canaan eventually. Verses 25 and 26.
Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt.
Okay. Also in the last set of verses, we see he's telling his brothers. So even though he is the second youngest, it doesn't say how many of his brothers, but a lot of his brothers must outlive him. Okay, but back to this. According to this passage and to Hebrews 11:22, Joseph was never buried. His coffin just laid above the ground the entire time that the Hebrews were in Egypt. It was just a silent witness that they were going back to the promised land. Now Joseph had a lot of things in his life that showed faith. Yet if you go to Hebrews 11, the Hall of Faith, it's this act that makes the Hall of Faith. The fact that he asked for his bones to be taken back to the promised land. This showed faith in God's promise. He knew where his body belonged. It takes 400 years for this to happen, but it's going to happen. So until then, they just left his coffin out, and for 400 years, people would pass by that coffin and see it. And when a child would see the coffin, they'd say, "Why is that there?" And they would answer, "Because the great man Joseph didn't want to be buried in Egypt, but in the promised land God will one day lead us to." So it was a forever promise. So he looks forward, he dies looking forward to God's plan. And that's where the book of Genesis, the book of the beginning, ends. It continues looking forward. We've seen the beginning of creation, the beginning of sin, the beginning of faith as a man named Abraham believed God and God declared him righteous. We've seen this journey of faith as we followed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now it's on to the next phase. We'll do a brief overview of Exodus, and then next week we'll really get into Exodus. So the word Exodus, most of you probably know, means exit, means leaving. Okay. But that's not the original name of the book. The way the Hebrews name their books, they name their books after the first words of every book. Genesis was Genesis because Genesis means beginning, and in Hebrew, beginning was the first word. Well, the first words in Exodus are, and these are the names. So whatever the Hebrew was, that was what the name of Exodus originally was. Exodus, the word Exodus wasn't used until the time of Jerome, and the time the first Latin Bible was written. That was about 382 BC. So it didn't get the name Exodus till 382, not BC, AD. It's agreed that it was written by Moses. It says several times in there, written by Moses. This is where we're going to see God fulfilling the promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are no direct messianic prophecies in Exodus, but there's lots of pictures of Christ, especially in the life of Moses, that we see. There's not a lot of agreement on exactly when this period of time was. A lot of scholars think it was 1446 BC, but in Exodus 1:11 we see that they're building the city of Ramesses, and Ramesses is probably Ramesses II, and he was in Egypt from 1279 to 1213 BC. So somewhere in there, a long, long, long time ago. The book is going to cover 216 years. So Egypt at this time is politically and economically strong. In fact, it is probably the strongest, it has been strongest it will ever be during this period of time. It's during what's called the 18th kingdom. If you thought Egypt had one line of pharaohs that inherited everything, no, 18th kingdom at this point. 18th different set of families ruling. They were in, Egypt was a really desirable country, so different groups would come in and conquer them. There was even a time where they were ruled by Ethiopian families. But this is a time where Egypt itself is super strong. It's not the same family that was there when Jacob was around. This kingdom has three of the most famous pharaohs. Amenhotep, if you ever saw the movie The Mummy, that pharaoh. Tutankhamun, King Tut, and Ramesses. So if you think of pharaohs' names, those are probably three of the pharaohs' names you think of. They're ruling during this whole time period. So the pharaohs from Joseph's time have been overthrown, no relation at all. And that's why we run into the things where they forget about Joseph, because they don't have any relation to him. Now, there is nothing in written evidence in Egypt at all about the Exodus. Huge event. A couple million people leaving your country, and all these plagues and everything else. Seems strange that it wouldn't be in their history. Except the Egyptians were super proud people. This was a failure. They didn't write about failures. So if people say, well, why isn't it in history? You find bad history about the Egyptians and you've really found something.
First example of revisionist history.
Yeah. Yeah.
First example of revisionist history. If you don't like the history, change it.
Yep. Yep. They didn't like their pharaohs to look bad. So, and this was major failure. So, didn't write about it. So, next week we will again really get into Exodus. And lots of good stuff in there. So, okay, hi Janice, she's watching. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the live off and we'll do prayer requests.